Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Timothy Adon. Welcome to another episode of Integrating Wwise into Unreal. Woo! Today we are going to talk about music integration. However, something I will mention, if you have watched my previous videos, then as far as the Unreal side of things, the Unreal blueprinting that I've been doing thus far, you're more or less done. The Unreal blueprinting we'll be doing in this episode is very similar to what we have done in the past, with a couple small exceptions. The main exception being that we're going to be talking about states, which, as far as I can remember, we have not actually talked about much before. So in this video, to kind of break the mold a little bit, I'm going to be going through the whole process, not just what I did in Wwise and Unreal, but also how I have everything set up in my DAW. We're not going to be spending too much time in my DAW. I'm just going to quickly show you how things are set up and what it sounds like before it hits Wwise. And then I'll go into everything that I've done in Wwise, which will be a majority of the episode, and then I'll go into the blueprinting at the end. If you want more specific details on the Wwise side of things, I highly suggest taking the Wwise 201 certification course. You find it on the Audio Kinetic website, and it doesn't cost you anything. It's perfectly free. Perfect. It's free is so perfect. It's totally free, and it tells you everything that you need to know about how music works in Wwise. Obviously, like everything else, it's not going to tell you about how it works in blueprints. That's why I'm here. But it will tell you, it'll go into greater detail as to how the integration works within Wwise than I will. And again, it doesn't cost any money. The only part of it that costs money is the exam, the certification exam, which is not a requirement. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. So here we are in my DAW, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about the music that I've written. So at the moment, I've actually only got two tracks. I've got my combat track, and I have my waiting track, quote-unquote waiting track. And since combat is going to be a majority of the game, I haven't really gotten to anything else. There is going to be one or two more tracks, but I might write those, when I have more of the game done, I think. So the way that I have this splayed out here is I have 5 different combat segments, each of which are 8 measures long, and each part of which is 8 measures long, except for the transitions. We'll go into that in a bit. 8 measures long with lead-in beats if you put those in. I didn't put those in on my basic combat tracks, only on my death tracks did I actually put lead-in beats. But that is something that you can plan in. So don't be afraid to put, I actually forgot the musical term for it. And I feel really bad. But the lead-in beats, you know what I'm talking about. And so how I have this set up is I have 2 bass layers, which are rendered out separately, 2 guitar layers, also rendered out separately, and you'll see why when I get into Wwise. 2 lead layers, which are not rendered separately. They're actually rendered together because, as far as I am concerned at the moment, they don't need to be separate. And then I have my transitions, which are an entirely different animal, but also rendered out separately. And then I have each layer of drum set also rendered out separately. And then the last thing you need to consider is naming conventions. You're going to have, whether you do a vertical approach, a horizontal approach, or a mixed approach, you're going to have a ton of audio tracks, and you need to make sure that you give them names that will make a ton of sense. So I have each of my parts put into separate folders so that I can find them easy if I need to. And then I have I didn't do that for some of these, but as I started getting deeper and deeper into this, I realized that I really needed to make sure that I named them correctly. And this is actually suggestions from the Wwise 201 certification course, by the way. Is you have a part in your name that tells you how many beats it has before it actually technically starts, so how many lead-in beats you have, what the tempo is, and how many measures long it is. And that can be very important once it actually comes to integration, because otherwise it could be a little on the difficult side to figure this out. You're going to have a lot of tracks. And so let's go ahead and listen to what just one segment of this sounds like. So, depending on your personal preference, that may or may not sound a little noisy to you. And believe me, I actually had more parts over there before. I had this section sitting over there as well, until I decided to move it for sorting purposes. And trust me, I agree with you. But this is totally okay, because the reason I have it set up like this is so that I could mute and solo different sections together and listen to how that sounds. Because what we're going to end up doing in Wwise is setting it up so that the gameplay adds or removes the instruments as we need them to in-game. So let's go ahead and move on over to Wwise. So now that we are in Wwise, there are quite a number of things to look at here. And like you've already, obviously you've probably watched my previous videos. These are all the sound effects that I did in those previous videos. But now we're going to be moving into the interactive music hierarchy folder, where music things tend to be quite a bit different. There's going to be a lot of similarities here, and you'll kind of notice that, but the differences are quite apparent. Since there's going to be a lot to explain here, I'm going to start from the top and then work our way down to the smallest unit. So I'm going to start at the biggest part and work our way down. At the top here, we have the music switch container, the property editor, as you already know. But for music-related things, in the property editor, you're also going to have time settings for tempo. And this way, you can set it up based on how your music is set up in the DAW, so that you can have, when you start syncing everything up, the Wwise will know where to sync things to musically for the purposes of timing. So the music switch container is very similar to the switch container for sound effects, but what this is going to end up doing is using states and switches to switch between all of the music containers that are contained within the switch container. So in order to see this, we're gonna need to see the music editor window. Now you can see I currently have 2 game states attached to this. And be prepared to go down the rabbit hole a little bit with this. So right now, the base state is game state. So this is where my combat as well as my waiting states will be. And on top of that, I also have my death, my victory, Reaper, which is going to be my boss battle, and none. Every state always has none as a default. And so you can utilize that if you want, but in general, you're going to want to set up all of your own states. And the important thing is that because it'll default to none, you're going to have to make sure that you set it up so that your default states are what you want them to be in the blueprint. You're going to want to use the blueprint to set your starting game states, unless none is okay. And then next over, we have game time. And right now, game time really only affects combat. So combat early game, combat mid game, combat late game, etc. If we wanted, again, this is where the rabbit hole starts to come in. If we wanted to, we could then add in, we could even use switch groups for this. I have a switch group for health level. So let's go ahead and do that. Now we can have combat early game, full health, or combat early game, half health, or combat early game, low health. And we can have tracks associated to each of those, or containers. And we'll talk about the next level of containers in just a moment. And then if we wanted to go even deeper, I could do one for floor materials. What am I standing on today? Oh, we're in a fight, and it's mid-game, and I'm at half health, and I'm standing on metal. I have a track for that. And you could just keep going. Like, just kill streak level. Do I have another switch group? Sure, announcer approval. Why not? And you can just keep on going, and now I have to remove these. But right now I just have the 2 states. At some point I'm actually going to add in player hit points, as well as probably audience approval for some other things. But as it is, once you have these set up and you start attaching your playlist to it, what you do is, like, if you say dead, late game, like what track do you want to play when you die in the late game? Add path. Dead, late game. So dead.late game, that is the path. And then you can add a playlist to it of the playlists that are included within the switch container. So as it is, I have combat early game, combat mid game, combat late game, and then just dead, victorious, the Reaper, which I'm definitely planning on adding multiple tracks for game time as well as hit points. And then waiting. Which again, waiting is just by itself and doesn't use game time because that's before the game even starts. Although I guess technically because the game will start like when the game initializes, it'll set itself to early game. I could technically set it up so it's waiting early game, but in the end it doesn't really matter. At least not yet. And then how do you transition from playlist to playlist? Well, that's what the transitions tab is for. And this is where you can set up all of your transition rules. So all transitions always have an any to any as default, which you can kind of set up a little bit how you want. But if you want to go a little bit more specific, you can go any to dead, which I currently have set up so that at the next beat of the music, and this is where setting up your musical time in the container is important. At the next beat of your music, it'll transition straight to the dead track. Doesn't use any transitions, doesn't have anything special set up here, just straight to dead. Alternatively, if you then respawn, you can then transition from dead to any, which will be immediate. So as opposed to waiting for the next beat, it'll just go. It'll just transition. But while it does that, it will also play the end of the death track. For something a little bit more interesting, we have early game to mid game, where I currently have it set up to play one of my transitions, which I have in their own folder. And I have 2 different transitions that are noise and 2 different transitions that are stutters. And you'll hear those in just a little bit. And those are set up to, or this one specifically is set up to go at the exit cue, which is basically the end of the 8-bar segment that I've created. But we'll play the post-exit, which are things like reverbs. Reverbs, delays, anything that is going to occur after the actual end of the segment will still play. That way it's a nice smooth transition from one to the other. And mid-game to late game, which is just next cue, because you can create your own custom cues so that it can transition sooner than the end of a segment. So like I could have it set up so that it'll transition at either the end of the 8-bar segment or right at the 4-bar mark. And again, it'll play post-exit and the stutter transition. And then from any to level complete. And you can create any combination of these. You can create combinations. You could create a transition for literally every combination if you wanted to. You probably won't need to if you know that certain combinations aren't going to exist. Like I know that I'm not going to go back from late game to mid game. But at some point I will add a transition for like when the Reaper battle occurs. And I'll need to add in a transition for maybe any to Reaper or specifically from mid game to Reaper, etc., etc. Going down a little deeper, you have the music playlist containers. And that is essentially exactly how it sounds. It is a container for a playlist. And again, we need to look at, I keep on closing this and I really need to stop, the music editor window. So this is my waiting playlist, essentially, my about to die track. So this is what plays before the game starts. And in here, we just have a single random continuous playlist that will randomly and continuously, as the container states, play through these 3 sections. And of course, it keeps on missing 2, but you get the point. And because I have it set to infinite, it'll just infinitely loop through this, forever and always until the state changes. Now, playlist containers can get a little bit more complex. This is a very extremely basic playlist. Now, if we were to go, let's look at early game. Early game has a little bit more going on. And of course, again, this is still very simple, but these can get incredibly complex if you want them to. So this one has a sequence continuous container within it, within the playlist. And what that means is that it will play everything in here in sequence. Right now it's just the intro. Well, it's the intro and the other sequence continuous container that's in here. So it'll first play the intro, and then it'll play the track after that, and then it'll play the track after that, etc., etc. The other ones are sequence step, which means when this gets called, it plays the thing, and then it moves on to whatever next section there is. And then when it gets called again, it plays the next thing in the sequence and so forth. And then there's also random step, which is similar but plays a random track. So how this works is that once the early game state occurs, it'll play the intro, and then it'll play this container infinitely, which just has the theme, the combat theme. So if we were to just play that, and that is how that will end up working out. And you can, again, this is another rabbit hole moment. You could set this up to have a series of sequence continuous playlists with sequence step playlists that then bleed into random playlists that then feed back to the continuous playlist, and like just so on and so forth. So I could say, let's set this to random step. And say in here, I add a new group that is a sequence step. And just for fun, we'll add another one. We'll promote it to that. There we go. That is a sequence continuous. Okay, so now, if we were to look at this, whenever the early game state gets called and then is in effect, it'll play through this sequence continuous once, which will play the intro. Then, because it's a sequence, it'll move on to random step, which will then, the random step will play. Hold on, I need a better example here. I need one more group. There we go. Okay, so sequence. It plays the intro. It plays the random step. Random step will randomly select one of these things and play it. So like it could either play through one round of the arena theme, or play through something within sequence step, or play through everything within this sequence continuous. And then once it plays one of those three things, it will then move on to sequence continuous, where it will play everything within this sequence, and then it'll start back over at the top. However, if we have this set to random continuous, once we go through the intro and then hit this step, because this is playing infinitely, it will just continuously randomly play through these three things infinitely. And we'll probably never hit this. Hopefully that made sense. Now, looking at my other playlists, I just have mid-game, which is just mid-game, which is just the theme, and late game, which is also just the theme. This brings us to the last the last layer of the music playlists, which is the music segment. So this is going to be the easiest one to look at. These are my marching drums. Each music segment just consists of a single instrument on a single track. And for the most part, when you import your music, this is kind of what it's going to look like, as a single track. So inside of each music segment are all of the parts contained within. Right now, this just contains the marching drum. However, if I look at something like the intro, this has 3 parts, and technically it has more than that. So technically it only has 3 tracks, which is bass, form, which is one of my synths, bass, contact, which is the contact instrument, and my plinks, which is actually my arpeggiator, and I just called them plinks because I was lame. But they also sound like plinks, like seriously. Like, listen to this. And then within each of these tracks are subtracks, which you can add by right-clicking on them. And that becomes important if you change what kind of track it is. So like there's normal tracks, which is what the marching drums are. And then you've got random step, sequence step, and switch. So random step and sequence step, if you remember from the playlist containers, work very similarly here. Random step is every single time this instrument plays, a random track, or a random subtrack for that track will play. For sequence step, which is what the bass is, whenever this music segment plays or gets called to play, it'll take the first one in line and play it, and then when it gets to the next section, it will play, or when it gets called to play again, it will play the next subtrack, and so on and so forth. You could have any number of subtracks, and some of those subtracks could have silence. I could move this down here, and because this is a sequence, the first time it gets called, it will play the first bass subtrack. Then the next time it gets played, it will play silence. Then the next time it gets played, it will play the next bass subtrack, and so on and so forth. And then down here you've got a random one, which is every time it gets called, it just picks a random subtrack from the list and will play it. This gives you another layer of control. On top of having the music switch container, which allows you to use states and switches to switch between any number of different tracks, you also then have the step container, or the step track, and the random track, as well as a switch track, which then utilizes states and switch containers in order to switch out the instruments or the parts that each of your tracks is then playing. So, looking at something a little bit more complex, let's look at the early game arena theme. So this is my bass. You know, the first layer of bass, the second layer of bass, my claps, my hi-hat, my kick, my snare drum, my first guitar, which is just one layer of my guitar. The other layers of guitar comes in the other playlists. My arpeggiator and my lead. And all doing some different things. So like the bass is playing in sequence, but the claps, the hi-hat, the kick, the snare are all playing random, while the guitar is again playing in sequence, and then the arpeggiator and the lead are playing randomly. But you'll notice that if I play this, oops, that not everything is playing, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But this gives you so much control for how your music plays. And so if I were to go to claps and set them up to be a switch instead, I could then go clap into the property editor and select a switch group or state group to assign it to. And then once I do that, I can then start assigning each of these tracks to a different state or switch, which again, just more capacity to make it even more interactive. However, I'm going to leave this on random because that's what I want out of that for now. And that is all of the different layers of this. Now, as to why certain of my instruments are playing when others are not, even though they are all in this music segment, because clearly the claps are playing but the snare drum is not. And obviously the guitar is playing but the lead is not, and so on and so forth. And the plinks, or the arpeggiator, which is also in here, is not playing. And that is yet another layer of customization that you can have. So if you look at plinks and go to states, the states tab, this is another place where you can then set up how your music behaves. Because right now, technically, if I play the arena theme, the arpeggiator and the lead are actually technically playing. But what's happening is that because the kill streak level is at 0, I have the volume turned completely off. But what happens is if I go from 0 to a low kill streak level, at the next cue, or at the next cut, at the next cue, it will go up to bass volume and start playing at a kind of a lower volume, which the lead will also do a similar thing, while the guitars will actually get quieter in order to give a little bit of space for the lead to play. So if we go to arena theme, early game, and for now let's actually change the RTPC a little bit so that you can hear some things. So you can hear that I not only am using the music switch container to switch between the types of music, but also using states to manipulate the volumes of instruments within each of those playlists in order to give even more variability depending on what's going on. I could alternatively just create new playlists that include those instruments while removes others, but at the moment this is kind of how I want to do it, because if I really wanted to, I could then utilize these game states to also add low pass filters and high pass filters, which is also technically something you could do by creating new playlists, but I don't want to. And that's kind of like, you have the freedom to do that, and that's cool. This gives you a lot of freedom to handle your music the way that you want to handle it. And then similarly, we're using game states here, but we can also utilize RTPCs, and you kind of saw me do that a little bit, where before you were just hearing the clap, and then when I started playing the music, you heard the snare drums and everything else. And that's because I also have an RTPC going, where if the audience approval rating gets up high enough, we cut out the snare and instead add in the clap, because now the audience is clapping, and I'm proud of myself for that. And so now, if we were to play this music some more, let's go to mid-game. And so what's interesting about that is that with the RTPCs, it is an instant change. There isn't it changed from this number to this number, let's wait until the next beat before that happens. And so, in some cases, using an RTPC might be a little too jarring in some situations. But in this case, because we're switching from a snare drum to a clap, which have very similar acoustic properties in this case. So I've talked about it a few times, but I've never actually done much in the way of talking about the differences between switches and states. On the outside, they kind of seem like they do very much the same thing. The main differences is kind of how they get called and how they change. So in Unreal, you could actually use a set switch node to say set your switch to good for announcer approval, or to set your state, use a set state node to change from combat to victorious. And both of those will work just fine. Switches can also be changed by RTPCs if you wanted to do that, which is kind of interesting because you can use that, use RTPCs to then subtly change how music functions. And really, as far as what you would prefer to use over another thing, it's kind of up to personal preference. When I did some researching into it, people seem to use game states for more global changes, and then switches for more personal individual changes. But in the end, you can use game states for small personal changes, which I did, like using kill streaks, using the kill streak state. And you can use switches for global changes, which is just not something I'm doing. So in the end, as far as whether you choose to use switches or game states, it is kind of up to personal preference and your own personal workflow, as well as how the game works. The last thing to remember is absolutely create a play event for your music switch container in here, and then add it to your sound banks. Once you've done that, we can now move on to Unreal. So now that we are in Unreal, I'm going to show you how to do the hardest part. Are you ready? It's going to be very difficult. I hope you're ready for it. You're going to open up. Whoa. See, definitely the hardest part. You're going to open up the level blueprint, find event begin play. This is where my UI stuff gets built. And then right at the end of that, we're setting the game state. Since you have to enter in text here, what I like to do is copy and paste the state names straight from Wwise so that I know I'm getting it right. Because, if you get it wrong, then nothing will happen. And then, boom. Post-event, play music. Obviously, just like sound effects, you have to open the Wwise picker, grab your event out of there, and then I placed an object in the center of my map that just holds on to the event for me. And then boom, right after that, set another state. Game time, early game. That way this one sets up waiting so that as soon as this plays, it's already got the correct state sitting there for me. And then this will hit right after so that when the game actually starts, it'll be ready. Bam! Hardest part. Done. Okay, that's not entirely true. But setting up these states is incredibly important before you get to anything else. Because if you don't set the states when the game starts, then all of your states will default to none. And like if you have it set up to if you have Wwise set up to make that work, then that's not a problem. However, I didn't want to make it a problem at all, so I have my game states set up as is. Separately, my kill streak state is also set up. It's actually not technically set up, but since it updates on every frame what my game state is, then I don't have to worry about it because it's setting itself up at every frame. But seriously, it is that simple. You just need to make sure that you have somewhere where at the beginning of the game your music starts playing, and you have to have your states set up. After that, it's all gravy. It's just a matter of figuring out where your states need to get changed. So as far as that's concerned, if you remember from my previous videos, I have my elevator, and there's a trigger at the top of the elevator that sends an event to everything that the game has, that sends an event to everything that has the start game interface, and it sends the start game event. So in this case, once I hit the trigger, it sets the state to game has started, or it sets my game has started Boolean to true, and then it sets the game state to combat. And that means that once the transition period has gone through, which I think is at the end of the exit queue for when it goes from waiting to early game, or from waiting to combat, then the combat music will start playing. Similarly, once the game end has triggered, then depending on why that is true, we set game has started to false, which should kill all of the robots on the map, and then we set the game state to either victorious if the player is alive, dead if the player has died. And that's it. That's already most of my states. So to view the rest of these, first is the trigger for mid-game and late game. So this is my spaghetti of a countdown timer, which is those right there, which basically once my integers reach a certain point, right here is if seconds is equal to 0, it checks to see if minutes is equal to 0. So if game is over, it sends the end game message, which will set my states to one of the two end game conditions. If false, then if minutes is equal to 0, then mid-game occurs. Since my game is 2 minutes long, that means that as soon as we hit 60 seconds, because there won't be any minutes anymore, it'll just be seconds, or 59 seconds, something like that, then the set state trigger will go to mid-game. Once we go down here, if seconds is equal to 0, it checks to see if minutes is equal to 0, and if minutes is equal to 0, then if seconds is equal to or less than 15, we go to late game. Basically, late game is the last 15 seconds of the game, which, I'll fiddle around with as time goes on, but that's how I have it set up at the moment. Similarly, for my kill streak state, I actually have it so that at the start of the game, we set the kill streak state to 0, because something that was happening was that I didn't do this, and it was defaulting to none. And what happens is that in the none state, my volumes were set to normal for the arpeggiator and the lead instrument, and that meant that they were playing when they weren't supposed to. Or rather, you could hear them when they weren't supposed to. They're always playing, but you're not supposed to hear them yet. So this sets that to 0, which then every single tick while it's counting down, it'll also set the state for the kill streak level, whether If you take damage, it'll set it to 0. Or if you reach a high enough killstreak level, it'll either set the killstreak level to low or high. And that's it. Like, setting states is really just putting nodes at the end of the rest of your code to set the state to whatever is appropriate for the time. And then a lot of my switches are really just using RTPC values, which are also set up at the end of strings of code like this. So what that's going to end up sounding like... And that's that. So now, one thing to think about is that for my Victorious and Death, they kind of end abruptly like that. The music is still technically playing, even though there's no sound, even though nothing is technically supposed to be playing at the time. The music switch container is still playing. So if you were to change state from Victorious to anything else that loops, that music will immediately transition to that based on your transition rules, and then start playing the music again. So that's something to keep in mind. You don't have to start the music event again. It's not like it ended. As long as your music switch container is set to loop, it'll just keep playing forever. Technically, in the background, it'll keep playing. And I made sure to be looking at the clock whenever it hit the 1 minute mark or the 15 seconds mark. And like, obviously there's a little bit of a delay, but that's because of the transition rules where it was waiting for the next cue before it transitioned. And that's really kind of like, at the moment, all there is to it. You just have to make sure that you plug your set state nodes, your set switch nodes, your RTPCs, all of those things. You just need to make sure that you put those in the right places, and that you always... redundancy is kind of key here. So like, if something is going to change in game, it's probably okay to add a set state node to the end of that. It's not like you're not going to have any problems by repeatedly calling the state over and over again. And obviously you saw a little bit of lagginess there. I'm having some weird video card issues, and that's a little unrelated. Or maybe it's completely related, but I won't know for sure until I play around with it. And then I can tell you, and then I could probably tell you I was wrong, and that updating a state every frame is a bad thing. But that is problems for future me. But it is very important to get your change state nodes in there. It's easy to forget, and that can mean that your music's not going to work entirely properly, but that's also a very good way to practice using the Wwise profiler, because every change of state and every switch change is going to be noted in the profiler as you go. So it's very easy to bug test your audio especially when it comes to music. And that is it for this video. If you have any questions and need me to clarify or extrapolate on something that I talked about today, feel free to let me know in the comments, or send me an email, or send me a carrier pigeon, who knows. And I will happily answer your questions. I try to respond to every comment that I get on these videos when I can. I hope this video has been helpful for you. This is probably going to be my last video for a little while, because really, like, there's not much else to talk about at the moment. Like, I didn't talk about stingers. I didn't talk about like using CPU resources and how to manage that, but that's also because that's not something that I've actually looked into myself. So I haven't done dialogue either, or at least not much. And so, there's a few things left that I haven't actually covered, but I'm probably not going to cover those for a while. Unless you ask me to. If there's something that you really want me to do a video on, I will absolutely put together a video for it. Anyways, I hope this video has been helpful to you. Leave a like, subscribe, all the usual YouTube jargon. And you can also click my little coffee link in the description below. There's also my website down there as well. Buy me a coffee if you want. I need lots of coffee to make these. I hope you have yourselves a wonderful day, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye!